The Wildrake is a deep water saturation diving vessel at 2:20 in the very early hours of the morning of the 8th of August. Richard looked back at the bell. Richard relayed his findings to the surface, and then he and Victor began preparing for an emergency rescue.
Corruption on the high seas isn't just a pirate's tale. It's putting your life in danger at the hands of greedy corporations just to finish a contract. Is working underwater really worth the risk of death though? Like, would you risk your life to explore the unknown? Today's story happened when the early development of the North Sea oil and gas industry was going through its worst period of accidents. This particular accident sadly exemplified the lowest levels of greed, corruption, and incompetence reached by the offshore diving industry. Think of the most nightmarish, worst case scenario in your workplace, but make it lethal. In March of 1977, a single anchor leg mooring system, or SALM for short, was installed in the Thistle oil field as a loading facility for oil tankers. It had a buoy and riser that were connected to a gravity base on the seafloor. But by January of 1979, the buoy had become partially disconnected from the riser. The British National Oil Corporation, BNOC, remember that, had the buoy blown free of the riser with explosives and taken to Amsterdam for repairs. But the explosive charges damaged the riser, and by April of 1979, the riser was removed from the base by divers and taken to Norway to be repaired. Going back a little bit in time, in 1978, Brian Masterson, an English businessman and engineer, co-founded Infabco Diving Services Limited, which was a commercial diving company. BNOC awarded Infabco a contract for diving services. An investigative reporter, Brian Gould, would later discover that BNOC's offshore construction manager, Joe Singletary, facilitated Infabco's bid by allowing Masterson to examine his competitors' bids. After the accident that we're about to talk about today, BNOC Security Division and Grampian Police investigated the possibility that Masterson had actually bribed BNOC officials for contracts. And if this seems like major red flag number 1 to you today, I recommend keeping track in the comments because it's only going to get worse. On June 18th of 1979, BNOC contracted with Infabco to reinstall the SALM on its base in the Thistle field. So Joe Singletary and Terry Slusher were the folks who were at the forefront of the BNOC at the time. And they have been since rightfully singled out as being corrupt and incompetent. They disappeared from the company shortly after what we're going to talk about today, and apparently at the time they were just like flaunting their gold jewelry, flaunting their wealth, and you're going to see why that's in poor taste. In May of 1979, Infabco began negotiations for exclusive rights to Wildrake, and the system was certified by the DNV on July 3rd of 1979. In mid-July, 17 bell runs were conducted from the Wildrake to prepare the SALM base for the reattachment. During this period, several significant alterations were made to the diving system. The swivel connecting the lift wire to the bell was replaced with a pair of shackles. The clump weight below the bell, the thing that served as a backup recovery system, was removed to enable the bell to be launched over the side of the Wildrake rather than through the ship's moon pool. The bell's drop weights, another secondary means of bell recovery, were lashed to the bell frame with nylon rope to prevent their accidental release, because the accidental release of drop weights had actually caused fatal accidents years prior. But the Wildrake bell had no bell stage to keep the bottom hatch out of the mud if the bell became stranded on the sea bottom. So in late July and early August, Wildrake divers reattached the SALM buoy to the riser. They prepared the SALM for transport to the Thistle field. And on the night of August 7th of 1979, Richard Walker and Victor Gill, who had been in saturation since July 29th, were lowered to a depth of 485 feet in the Wildrake diving bell to work on the reattachment of the SALM to its base. So this was bell dive number 30 from the Wildrake. And as the bell was lowered into the ocean, its transponder came loose, and the Wildrake deck foreman was ordered to cut it off. Shortly after 2:20 a.m. on August 8th, Walker, who had been working outside the bell on the base, saw that the bell had become separated from its lift wire and was hanging at an angle by its life support umbilical. He reported the emergency, rejoined Gill in the bell, where the two divers closed and sealed the inside door. The bottom door, which opened outwards, was left open and secured back to the bell frame. Wildrake Dive Superintendent Peter Holmes and Dive Supervisor Brian Reed believed the umbilical was the correct secondary means of bell recovery in the system that had been designed. Turns out, the DNV had not certified the umbilical winch for bell recovery. Reed attempted to raise the bell with the umbilical, which was already damaged. The umbilical wheel on the ship's davit consisted of a rubber tire between two circular metal plates, and the umbilical became jammed between the tire and one of those side plates. A further attempt to raise the bell on the umbilical using the ship's crane damaged the umbilical even more severely, and power and hot water to the bell were completely cut off. A diving vessel by the name of Stena Welder came alongside the Wildrake to try and help with the rescue, but its diving system was undergoing repairs, and couldn't really be of much help. By 6:09 a.m., the Stina Welder diving bell entered the water carrying some rescue divers, Phil Casey Smith and Eddie Frank. But due to communication problems, failure of the lights on the Stina Welder bell, the absence of the Wildrake bell's transponder, and the fact that the Wildrake crew had forgotten that they had moved the bell away from the Salm base a few hours earlier, it took Casey Smith nearly an hour to find the Wildrake bell on the seafloor. By almost 8 a.m., he saw Walker and Gill giving him thumbs up through the porthole. Casey Smith spent another hour directing the recovery of the slack guide wire around the base. But because the Stina Welder was not a dynamic positioning vessel, it could not be held in a constant position, causing their bell to drag Casey Smith around the seabed on his umbilical. By 9:02, Casey Smith attached the guide wire to the bell, and the Wildrake began lowering its crane hook, but Casey Smith now saw that Walker and Gill's movements had become very frantic. The crane hook came down too far from the bell for Casey Smith to reach it with the wire slings attached to the hook. So the hook was raised, had further slings attached, and was sent down again to Casey Smith. He attached it to the Wildrake bell at 10:10. The Wildrake attempted to lift the bell from the bottom at a 45-degree angle rather than vertically, and without a visual confirmation that the bell was clear to be lifted. So during the lift, the bell wedged against the side of the Salm base, causing the wire sling to completely break. The end of the crane wire emerged from the sea at 12:20 without the Wildrake bell, which was again lost. When rescue diver Frank relocated the bell, he saw that Walker or Gill had attempted to cut the ropes on the drop weights to allow the bell to surface, but that only one of the two weights was cut free. And he also realized these stranded divers were not doing so well. They were very close to the end. At 7:37 p.m., the bell was finally lifted out of the ocean. It was docked to the Wildrake saturation system, where Morven White, who had been placed in saturation, examined the poor guys that were stuck inside and determined there was nothing they could do. The divers' postmortems in Aberdeen determined that they died of hypothermia, which is one of the worst ways to go. The next day, August 9th, the Department of Energy inspectors and police boarded the Wildrake to investigate all of this, and one inspector, Roy Giles, found multiple safety violations and evidence of negligence, which at this point shouldn't shock you with everything I've said. Richard Walker's widow and Victor Gill's family retained U.S. Attorney Gerald Stearns, who filed a wrongful death complaint in the United States on July 30th of 1980 against 10 defendants, including Infabco Diving Services. So on November 28th of 1980, Infabco was indicted on criminal charges in the court as the employer of Walker and Gill. At the criminal trial, which began on December 15th, the diving company used what later became known as the Infabco defense, claiming that the divers were actually employed by a company called Offshore Coordinators Limited, which was located in a bank on Jersey and registered in the Isle of Man. Most deep-sea divers are independent contractors, which makes for a fun legal situation in this situation. And by fun, I mean not fun. On December 19th, Sheriff Alistair Stewart ruled that the Crown had failed to prove that Infabco was the employer of the men, and directed the jury to find Infabco not guilty. In May of 1981, the United States District Court in Los Angeles awarded damages of $475,000 to Walker's widow and daughter, and $75,000 to Gill's family. But don't get excited. This judgment would never be enforced by the British court system. A fatal accident inquiry on the deaths was held from May 11th to 22nd of 1981, and at the inquiry, Walker's widow read aloud the final entry from her husband's diary, which was written on August 7th, in which he commented, "I don't even know if I'm going to get out of here alive." Folks, if you're following the timeline, that's from the day before the incident. Premonition is a terrifying thing. Sheriff Douglas James Risk found that the removal of the clump weight contributed to the diver's death, and that the absence of a bell stage indicated that the diving contractors were more concerned with speed than safety. He also concluded that the men could have probably been saved if Masterson had not ordered the crane lift to continue without investigating the obstruction impeding the lift, which proved to be the Salm base. On December 17th of 1981, there was a TV show, The Last Dive. It was a documentary that featured an investigative reporter and former member of Parliament Brian Gold, who alleged that an improper relationship existed between Brian Masterson and Joe Singletary, BNOC's offshore construction manager at the time of the incident. On July 23rd of 1982, the Edinburgh law firm of Simpson and Marwick filed suit in the UK against 12 defendants on behalf of the men's families. In December of 1986, the remaining defendants settled, agreeing to pay, I think, $293,000 to the Walkers and a smaller amount to the Gills. But no admission of wrongdoing was met by the defendants. And just in case all of this wasn't suspicious enough, in May of the year 2000, the Wildrake accident reports in London were missing. And unless my research is wrong, they haven't been found to this day. And that's all I have to say on that, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident ookie spooky girly. See you next time.